So a rooster is trying to cross a stream. He's thinking to himself, man, things would be easier if I could just get to the other side, but he can't figure out quite how to get it done. So he figures he'll just ask others how they get across, and it isn't long before an eagle shows up, and the rooster's like, hey, excuse me, how do you get across? The eagle looks him up and down, and he says, you have wings, just fly across. But the rooster's like, I don't really fly, my wings aren't that great. The eagle's like, it's easy, just watch me. He flies across. Now, a bit of time passes until a frog hops up and the rooster asks him the same question. The frog is like, well, you have legs, just swim across. The rooster's like, well, I can't really swim. And the frog says, well, it's easy, just watch me. And then he swims across. Well, this goes on all day until a crocodile comes up and the rooster is like, nice. This looks like a guy who knows how to cross a stream. And he's getting ready for the great advice when the crocodile comes up, eats him, and swims across. You can never have too much gold. That's true if you don't have to pay for it, but in any other case, it's just not. There's always going to be a point where having more gold means having less of something else. Where having more gold means maybe you can't pay your bills. Where having more gold puts you in a situation where maybe you simply don't have enough liquidity for a possible emergency. Now, all of those, they're just practical considerations, and if you ignore all that, yeah, sure, you can never have too much gold. That won't help you plan, but it's fun to say. You can never have too much gold. But now that we get that out of our system for a little while at least, how much really makes sense? Before we get back to it, if you're looking for gold or silver, check out SD Bullion. New customers even get gold and silver for spot. It's sdbullion.com/new. So let's start off with common advice in terms of percentages and amounts. And then we'll come back to some things like definitions, some important considerations, and then timing. Now, we've all heard 5 or 10% recommendations. Traditional advice is typically no more than 10% of your portfolio, no less than 3. Now, that comes from the kind of advice that you can find with a simple Google search online. And I'm not trying to give financial advice here. I'm not trying to tell you what's right or what's wrong. We're just setting a baseline for general advice. On the other side of this spectrum, I'm sure someone is out there typing a comment right now suggesting 90% in gold is the way. Now look, I'm personally a fan of gold, obviously, but I think we need to round this out, give one more bit of perspective. I've seen a lot of recommendations online, and they're all across the board from 0 to 90%, but I've never actually heard a financial planner recommend more than 3 to 5. So percentages of what? I think this is really important here. Those are other people's percentages. Percentages are tough because they don't account for a person's place in life. But before we get to that, we really have to explain what the percentage even means. What does 3 to 5% of a portfolio mean? Well, if you have $1 million across brokerage and retirement accounts, you would want $30,000 to $50,000 allocated to gold. So 12.5 to 20 ounces of gold if we're talking about physical gold at today's prices. Now, that is not what most financial advisors are talking about. They're talking about ETFs and some gold mining stocks maybe, but we're going to ignore that part for now. Now, where this idea of a portfolio allocation just goes off the rails is when a person doesn't have a traditional or a well-funded portfolio. That 3 to 5% or 10% allocation is meant as a hedge. Now, anyone heavily into real estate or even moderately into real estate knows that financial advisors rarely recommend the things that they don't directly manage. They don't get paid on it. Property typically doesn't fall under that umbrella, neither does physical gold. So if we're using percentages of a portfolio, we need to broaden the definition of portfolio to at least include more asset classes. Now, Gallup polls, they tend to use 6 asset classes. They have real estate, gold, stocks and mutual funds, savings, CDs, bonds, and cryptocurrency. Now, there are others out there like Knight Frank that publish annual reports showing ultra-high net worth individuals' wealth distribution among more classes than that. They'll split personal residence from investment properties. They'll add things like business or private equity, angel investments, collectibles. So the point here is that if we're going to come up with a useful percentage, it needs to be based on something more comprehensive than a person's stock portfolio. Maybe you're into Beanie Babies or Pokemon. I don't know. So I've always thought it was easier to think about the overall number being how much I've saved or how much I will have saved by the time I retire. Now, coming back to simple advice found in Google, you'll see cases for needing $1 million to retire, $2 million, $5 million. It really doesn't matter. The implied part there is that you need X amount saved. So it could be stocks, it could be savings, it could be gold, it could be Dogecoin, any asset that you could spend on future expenses, but not an asset that you need to live in or drive. So that's a lot more useful, right? Now we have a number to work from. So if that number today is $50,000 and your goal is to have $2 million by the time you retire, well, 5% of that would be $2,500 in gold today, which is currently about 1 ounce of gold, and $100,000 in gold when you retire. That'd be right around 40 ounces in today's value. Now, you can run the math based on wherever you are at the moment, but I don't think that's too far off as a blanket recommendation. Again, it's not my recommendation, it's the general advice that we've improved a little bit by redefining portfolio. Now, before we get into whether it should actually be 3% or 10% or 90% of your liquid assets, let's keep things focused on 5 because we still need to see what that means in real terms before we even decide what makes sense. So a new study was released showing how much you need to cover expenses in each of the states here in the US. In Massachusetts, you need $150,000 on average for a family of 4. You need about half that, $76,000 if you have no kids, which would be the more likely case if you're retired. And in Alabama, you need around $97,000 for that same family of 4, right around $58,000 for 2 adults, no kids. Now, if you're wondering what it takes to live for one person in Alabama, well, it's about $42,000. So I've cherry-picked highs and lows from their data. I'm going to link to the report in the description if you're interested in something more specific. But if we just round these numbers to give us some starting points, we're looking at $150,000 on the high side if you have kids in the house in an expensive state, $42,000 if it's just you and your dog in Alabama. So if you're thinking that you'll need $2 million to retire, 5% will eventually get you $100,000 in gold. That's based on the traditional advice of 5%. So if there are 2 of you living in Massachusetts, your kids are successfully launched if you have them, you would be able to cover about 16 months worth of expenses on that gold alone. In Alabama, with the same size family, you'd have closer to 21 months covered, and that's a pretty good emergency fund. So if you have 40 ounces of gold today, you're doing pretty well. Now, the problem with thinking like this, using a percentage of liquid assets, is that most people build wealth like this. They build more wealth later in life as income increases and early expenses like school loans, like mortgages, are paid off. So if you save gold along that same curve, you're buying a lot later in life, and you most likely wouldn't have the benefit of having it if an emergency hit when you're younger. And this at a time when expenses are higher because kids. So this is why we can't simply use a percentage of our portfolio or our savings or anything really unless we're basing it off the point of retirement. And even then I can think of cases where that doesn't really apply, but it does give us a goal number that I like. Having something to work to just gives us a direction. So personally, I have a retirement goal set. We'll just call it 100 ounces, but I wasn't okay saving it only on that style of curve that I showed earlier. I saved on a set amount each month, consistently adding up and to the right. Now, before that one person finishes typing a comment about how that could have performed on the S&P, I wasn't taking that from investments. I was reducing expenses to save a 1/4 ounce of gold a month. Now, that would be 3 ounces of gold a year. So let's do that math. It would take 33 years to get to a goal of 100 ounces. So somewhere along the way, yeah, I did have to speed up my buying. And just taking a wider view, here's how this started out for me. When I started buying gold, I raced to pick up 3 ounces. I felt that that would cover most emergencies that I might run into when I was 30 years old. So that would have been somewhere around $400 and $4,500 in value at the time. If that was 5% of my savings at that point, well, that would assume that I would have had around $90,000 available. Now, between you and me, I probably didn't. At that time, it was probably where I was most exposed to needing emergency backup funds because I was taking some business risks. I was putting a lot of what I had into real estate. When you're young, or at least when I was young, I didn't really think about getting knocked over until 2008 hit. And when it did, that really was a deciding factor for me to get a better backup fund, and that's what got me buying monthly. So really my point in telling you that side of the story is that until you retire, the amount that you might need in a possible emergency is a lot more relevant to how much gold you should have than some percentage of your portfolio, which is pretty much the only advice you're going to get on the topic Googling financial blogs. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about 3%, 5%, 10%, 90% of your portfolio if you don't have much of a portfolio. Imagine that. 90% of zero is still zero. So I like the idea of having 5% allocated to gold at the point of retirement, but anytime prior to that, I want at least enough to cover whatever I consider possible emergency cases. So on one hand, this is really all just a decision on asset allocation. The percentage is mostly about how comfortable you are with gold versus other classes. Now, I'm very comfortable with it, but I still think 5% is about right for me. You might think 50%. I would say use my 5% as a practical and possibly conservative case, but the more important part of my strategy is to buy consistently over time rather than just converting a bunch into gold all at once. So my thinking here is that 50-ounce emergency fund is about what I might need in an unplanned event. And that's a big number, I get it. My 100-ounce that I threw out just as a possible case, that's more about planned needs through retirement. Call it my long-term insurance. So that would be against the loss of value in other asset classes or all of these other things that could possibly happen. Now, I am not an alarmist. I'm just out here saying it makes sense to have a non-zero allocation to gold, and I'm trying to put some concrete numbers around what that actually means. Because unless it's the day of your retirement, I don't think percentages actually work. Okay, so let's call it good there. Those are my numbers. Let's see yours. If you plan around goals, if you use percentages, let us know. I'm curious personally. And then while you're in the comments, be sure to hit that like button if you found any of this interesting. Be sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on if you want to hear more on the topic. And if you're still here, thanks again for watching. I always appreciate your time. Take care.